The firehouse in Reading wasn't much to look at from the outside. A squat brick building with faded red doors, it sat at the edge of town like a sentinel, its paint peeling under the relentless California sun. But inside, it carried the weight of decades. Photographs of past crews lined the walls. Helmets hung in neat rows, and the faint smell of smoke and sweat lingered no matter how often the floors were scrubbed. Captain Mark Hanlon had spent 22 years in that house. He was a seasoned firefighter, broad-shouldered, his hair gone grey at the temples, his voice carrying the gravel of too many nights shouting over roaring flames. To the rookies, he was a legend, someone who had seen every kind of fire California could throw at a man. But Mark knew better. Fires were never the same. Each one had its own hunger, its own will. And lately, he'd begun to feel that some of them had something more. The crew that night was the usual mix. There was Torres, the joker of the group, always quick with a story to cut the tension. Miller, the rookie, still stiff in his gear, eager to prove himself. And Jackson, Mark's oldest friend on the line, a man who had fought beside him through infernos from Shasta to Sacramento. Together, they were a family forged in heat and ash, bound by the unspoken oath that no one gets left behind. The alarm came just after midnight. The klaxon blared, red lights flashing across the dormitory. Boots hit the floor, gear was pulled on in practice motions, and within minutes the engine roared to life. Mark slid into the passenger seat, headset crackling with dispatch. Wildland Fire reported off Highway 299 near the canyon ridge. Multiple callers. Flames visible, Mark frowned. Fires weren't unusual this time of year. California's summers were tinderboxes waiting for a spark. But something in the dispatcher's tone made his gut tighten. The drive out was quiet, the crew focused, the engine's siren cutting through the night. As they neared the ridge, the glow appeared on the horizon, a dull orange smear against the stars. But as they crested the hill, the sight made even Mark's breath catch. The fire moved wrong. Flames licked upward in jagged bursts, twisting against the wind. Shadows stretched long across the canyon, but they didn't match the fire's rhythm. They moved independently, writhing and shifting as if alive. For a moment, Mark thought he saw figures in the glow. Tall, thin shapes walking against the firelight. He blinked, and they were gone. Jesus, Torres muttered, staring out the window. That's not right! Focus! Mark snapped, though his own hands were tight on the dash. We hit it from the west flank. Contain before it jumps the road. They pulled up, the crew spilling out, hoses uncoiled, water hissing as it met the flames. The fire roared back, hotter than it should have been, sparks leaping high into the night. Mark shouted orders, his voice steady, but inside he felt the tether of unease pulling tighter. Miller froze mid-spray, his eyes wide. Cap, do you see that? Mark followed his gaze. In the heart of the flames, shadows moved. Not smoke, not tricks of the light. They walked upright, their forms flickering, their edges glowing like embers. They shifted between the trees, their movements deliberate, almost human. Mark's throat went dry. Keep working, he barked, dragging Miller back to the hose. Eyes on the fire, not the tricks it plays. But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't just tricks. The fire pushed harder, as if alive, forcing them back. The heat was unbearable, the roar deafening. Mark felt the ground tremble beneath his boots, the tether in his chest pulling him toward the flames. For a heartbeat, he thought he heard his name whispered in the crackle of burning wood. Then, as suddenly as it had surged, the fire collapsed inward. The flames shrank, the shadows retreating, the canyon falling eerily silent. The crew stood panting, their faces pale, their gear streaked with ash. What the hell was that? Torres whispered. Mark didn't answer. He stared into the smoldering canyon, the last embers glowing like eyes in the dark. He knew fire. He had lived his life inside it, but this was something else. Back at the engine, Miller's hands shook as he coiled the hose. Cap, I swear I saw people in there, walking, watching us. Mark clapped a hand on his shoulder, firm. You saw shadows. Fire does that. Plays tricks. But his voice lacked conviction, and Miller knew it. As they drove back to the station, the crew sat in uneasy silence. The night outside was too still, the stars too sharp. Mark stared out the window, his reflection pale in the glass. He thought of the figures in the flames, the way they had moved against the firelight. He thought of the whisper that had carried his name, and for the first time in his career, he felt something colder than fear. The fire had looked back at him, and it wasn't finished. The call came just before dawn, when the crew was still shaking off the smoke and exhaustion from the ridge fire. The dispatcher's voice was clipped, urgent. Structure fire, rural cabin off Deer Creek Road, possible occupant inside. Mark Hanlon rubbed his eyes, the fatigue heavy in his bones. They hadn't even had time to clean the ash from their gear, but duty didn't wait. Within minutes, the engine was rolling again, headlights cutting through the grey morning haze. The cabin was already half gone when they arrived. Flames chewed through the roof, smoke billowed into the sky, and the surrounding pines glowed with embers. The fire moved strangely, curling in on itself, shadows flickering across the clearing in ways that didn't match the flames. Mark felt the tether in his chest again, that same pull he'd felt at the ridge. "Get in there!" he barked, and the crew moved fast. Torres and Miller advanced with the hose. Jackson circled to check the back. Mark pulled on his mask and pushed through the doorway, the heat slamming into him like a wall. Inside, the cabin was a furnace. Furniture collapsed in showers of sparks. The walls groaned, and the air was thick with smoke. But through the roar, Mark heard something else. A voice, faint, ragged, calling for help. He pushed deeper, following the sound. In the corner of what had once been a living room, he found him. A man curled on the floor, his clothes burned, his skin blackened with soot. His eyes were wide, wild, and when Mark lifted him, the man clutched at his jacket with surprising strength. "They're in the smoke," the man rasped. The shadows. "They whispered my name." Mark froze, the words cutting through the roar of the fire. For a heartbeat, he thought of the figures he'd seen in the ridge flames, the way they had moved against the firelight. "Save your strength," Mark said, dragging him toward the door. The man coughed, his voice breaking. "You can't fight them. They're already here." Mark hauled him outside, where Torres and Miller helped lower him onto a stretcher. The paramedics rushed in, checking his vitals, strapping an oxygen mask over his face. His skin was grey, his lips cracked, but his eyes never left the flames. "They're watching," he whispered through the mask. "They never stop watching." The crew exchanged uneasy glances. Miller looked pale, his hands trembling as he coiled the hose. Torres muttered under his breath, "What the hell is he talking about?" Mark didn't answer. The fire consumed the cabin within minutes, collapsing in on itself with a roar. The survivor was loaded into the ambulance, his eyes still fixed on the smoke curling into the sky. Mark stood watching until the sirens faded down the road. Back at the station, the crew tried to shake it off. Torres cracked jokes, Miller buried himself in cleaning gear, Jackson sat silent, staring at the floor. But the words lingered. The shadows. They whispered my name. Mark opened his private logbook that night, the one he kept hidden in his locker. He wrote down every detail, the way the fire had moved, the survivor's words, the look in his eyes. He underlined the phrase twice. They whispered my name. The next morning, Mark called the hospital to check on the man. The nurse hesitated, then said, "I'm sorry, Captain Hanlon." "He's gone." Mark's chest tightened. "Gone?" "He was alive when we brought him in." The nurse's voice was uneasy. "He wasn't stable." But that's not the strange part. His chart says he unhooked himself from the monitors sometime after midnight, walked out of the ward. Security never saw him leave. We've searched the grounds. He's just gone. Mark hung up, staring at the phone in his hand. That evening, he drove back to the site of the cabin. The ruins were still smouldering, the air heavy with the smell of wet ash. He walked the perimeter slowly, boots crunching in the blackened dirt. At the edge of the clearing, he stopped. In the soot, burned into the ground, were footprints, bare feet, leading away from the ruins and into the trees. Mark crouched, tracing the prints with his gloved hand. They were sharp, distinct, too fresh to have survived the fire. He followed them a few steps into the timber, but they ended abruptly, vanishing into the undergrowth. The forest was silent, the pines swaying gently in the breeze. But Mark felt it again, the tether in his chest, pulling, urging him deeper. He stood there for a long time, staring into the shadows between the trees. Finally, he turned back. At the station, he wrote another entry in his logbook. "We pulled a man from the fire today." He said the shadows whispered his name. He vanished from the hospital without a trace. "I found footprints in the ash." They ended in the trees. "I don't know if he walked out, or if something took him. But I know this. The fire is not just fire. It's something else. Something watching." He closed the book, locked it away, and sat in the silence of the firehouse. Outside, the wind shifted. carrying with it the faint smell of smoke, and in the distance, Mark thought he heard voices. The call came in the late afternoon, when the heat of the day still pressed down on the valley like a weight. Dispatch reported a fast-moving wildfire near the Shasta Trinity Forest, flames visible from the highway. Mark Hanlon felt the knot in his stomach tighten as the crew scrambled into gear. They had barely recovered from the cabin fire and the strange survivor's words, but there was no time to dwell. California didn't wait. The engine roared down the road, sirens wailing, the crew silent in their seats. Torres tapped his helmet nervously. Miller stared out the window, and Jackson sat with arms crossed, jaw tight. Mark studied the horizon. A thick column of smoke rose above the ridges, black and roiling, spreading wider by the minute. When they arrived, the fire was already a monster. Flames leapt from tree to tree, racing uphill against the wind. The air shimmered with heat, the roar deafening. Mark had fought hundreds of wildfires, but this one moved wrong. It didn't spread naturally. It surged, as if driven by something unseen. "Set the line here," Mark shouted, pointing to a clearing where they could anchor the hoses. "We hold it before it jumps the ridge." The crew moved fast, uncoiling hoses, water hissing as it met the flames. But the fire pushed back, hotter and faster than it should have been. Sparks rained down like meteors, igniting brush yards ahead of the main blaze. Miller's voice cracked over the radio. "Cap, it's moving against the wind!" Mark saw it too. The flames bent unnaturally, curling uphill even as the gusts blew the other way. It was as if the fire had its own will, its own direction. Then came the shadows. At first, Mark thought it was smoke. Dark shapes flickering in the glow, shifting between the trees. But as he watched, the shapes grew clearer. Tall, thin figures, their edges glowing like embers, moving with deliberate steps. They walked inside the fire, untouched by the heat, their forms writhing like living shadows. Torres froze mid-spray, his eyes wide. "Cap, do you see that?" Mark's throat went dry. "Keep working," he barked, though his own hands trembled.
"Eyes on the fire!"
But the crew couldn't look away. The figures moved closer, their forms flickering, their heads turning as if watching. The fire roared louder, the heat pressing against their skin. And then the radios crackled. At first it was static. Then words emerged, distorted, layered. "Mark." The voice was faint, ragged but unmistakable. It was his father's voice. His father had been dead for 15 years. Mark ripped the headset off, his heart pounding. The tether in his chest pulled hard, dragging him toward the flames. For a moment he felt his boots shift, his body leaning forward. Jackson grabbed his arm, yanking him back. "Don't!" he shouted over the roar. "It's not real!" Mark blinked, the spell breaking. The figures flickered, their forms dissolving into smoke. But the fire surged higher, sparks leaping into the sky. "Fall back," Mark ordered.
"We can't hold it here!"
The crew retreated, dragging hoses, the fire chasing them with unnatural speed. They regrouped at the highway, sweat pouring down their faces, their gear streaked with ash. The flames roared across the ridge, consuming everything in their path. For hours, they fought to contain it, cutting lines, spraying water, calling in air support. But the fire refused to die. It twisted, surged, and doubled back as if taunting them. By dawn, the ridge was blackened, the forest reduced to ash. The crew sat on the tailboard of the engine, exhausted, their faces pale. Miller's hands shook as he lit a cigarette, his eyes haunted. "I heard my brother," he whispered. "On the radio. He's been dead 2 years." "But I heard him," Torres nodded slowly. "I heard my mother. She was calling my name." Mark said nothing. He stared at the smouldering ridge, the smoke curling into the sky. He thought of the figures in the flames, the voices on the radio, the tether pulling at his chest. Back at the station, he opened his private logbook. His handwriting was jagged, uneven, but he forced the words onto the page. The fire at the ridge moved against the wind. Shadows walked inside the flames. The radios carried voices of the dead. "I heard my father." The others heard their own. "The fire is not just fire. It knows us. It calls us." He closed the book, his hands trembling. Outside, the sun rose over the valley, the sky painted in streaks of red and gold. For a moment it was beautiful. But Mark knew better. The fire was alive, and it was watching. The call came not from dispatch, but from the sheriff's office. A deputy reported smoke rising from the outskirts of a small rural town west of Reading. The source, an abandoned church that had stood empty for decades. No power lines, no squatters, no reason for fire. Yet by the time Mark Hanlon and his crew arrived, the structure was already gutted, flames licking the last of its roof beams. The church had been a landmark once, a white-painted clapboard building with a steeple that pointed toward the sky. Now it was a blackened skeleton, its bell collapsed, its windows shattered. The air reeked of scorched wood and something acrid, almost metallic. "Strange place for a fire," Torres muttered, pulling his mask down. "Nobody's been here in years." "Stranger still," Jackson said, pointing to the ground. "No tracks, no tire marks, nothing." Mark studied the ruins. The fire had burned hot, too hot for a structure left to rot. The flames had eaten through the walls in patterns that didn't make sense, curves and arcs, as if drawn by a deliberate hand. They moved cautiously inside, boots crunching on charred debris. The pews were reduced to ash, the altar collapsed. But what made the crew stop cold were the walls, silhouettes, dozens of them, burned into the wood. Dark outlines of human figures, frozen mid-gesture, their arms raised, their heads tilted back. Some looked as if they were praying, others looked like they were screaming. Miller's voice cracked. "What the hell?" Torres stepped closer, running a gloved hand over one of the silhouettes. The wood was smooth, polished by heat, but the outline was sharp, too precise. It wasn't random scorching. It was deliberate. Mark felt the tether in his chest tighten. The figures seemed to lean toward him, their burned faces eyeless but intent. He swallowed hard, forcing his voice steady. "Document it. Then we're out." As they worked, a sound drifted through the ruins. At first it was faint, like wind through broken glass. Then it grew clearer, a low murmur, layered, rising and falling like a chant. Miller froze, his flashlight trembling. "Cap, do you hear that?" Mark did. The voices seemed to come from the walls themselves, from the silhouettes burned into the wood. Words he couldn't understand, but the cadence was unmistakable. Prayer, or something like it. The crew backed toward the door, their lights sweeping across the ruined sanctuary. For a moment Mark thought he saw movement, shadows flickering across the far wall, shifting against the glow of dying embers. Figures that weren't there when the light passed again. Outside, the night was cool, the stars sharp above the valley. But the church still glowed faintly, as if embers smoldered deep within. The sheriff arrived, his cruiser crunching over gravel. He was a broad man with tired eyes, his badge dulled by years of service. He studied the ruins, then the crew. "You saw it too, didn't you?" Mark stiffened. "Saw what?" The sheriff's gaze lingered on the silhouettes. "This isn't the first time. My grandfather told me stories, fires that left shadows behind. People said the flames remembered who they took." Torres scoffed, but his voice lacked conviction. "You're saying the fire keeps them?" The sheriff didn't answer. He just looked at the church, his jaw tight. "Best you boys stay sharp." The valley's been restless. Back at the station, the crew sat in uneasy silence. Miller scribbled in his notebook, his hands shaking. Torres paced, muttering. Jackson stared at the floor, his face pale. Mark opened his private logbook again. His handwriting was jagged, uneven, but he forced the words down. The church fire left silhouettes burned into the walls. Figures of people, too precise to be chants. Voices whispered from the ruins, chanting. The sheriff said the flames remember. If that's true, then the fire is not just alive. It's a graveyard. He closed the book, his chest tight. That night, he dreamed of the church. He stood in the ruins, the silhouettes glowing faintly, their mouths opening in unison. They whispered his name over and over, until the sound became a roar. He woke gasping, the smell of smoke in his nostrils, the tether in his chest burning like a brand. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it the faint echo of voices, and Mark knew the burning shadows were only beginning to reveal themselves. The firehouse was supposed to be a refuge. After long shifts on the line, after nights of smoke and ash, the station was where the crew could breathe, laugh, and remember they were human. But lately, even the firehouse felt wrong. It started with the alarms. One night, just after midnight, the klaxon blared, red lights flashing across the dormitory. The crew scrambled, boots hitting the floor, gear pulled on in seconds. But when they reached the engine bay, there was no call. The radio was silent. Dispatch hadn't paged them. The alarm had triggered on its own. "Faulty system," Torres muttered, rubbing his eyes. "Old wiring." But when it happened again the next night, And again, the night after that, the excuses wore thin. Mark Hanlon stood in the bay, staring at the silent radio, the red lights still pulsing faintly. He felt the tether in his chest hum, a low vibration that seemed to sync with the alarm. He didn't say anything to the crew, but he knew. The firehouse wasn't safe anymore. The shadows came next. At first they were fleeting, flickers across the walls, shapes that vanished when the lights were turned on. But soon they grew bolder. Figures lingered in the corners of rooms, stretched long across the floor, moving against the glow of the overhead lamps. Miller was the first to speak up. He'd been sitting in the radio room, headphones on, when he froze. "Cap," he whispered, his face pale. "There's someone in the hall," Mark checked. The hall was empty, but Miller swore he'd seen a man standing there, tall and thin, his outline glowing faintly like embers. The crew grew restless. Torres stopped cracking jokes. Jackson kept his back to the wall, his eyes scanning the corners. Miller barely slept, his hands trembling whenever the radio hissed. Then came the voices. It was Miller again, sitting alone on night watch. The radio crackled, static filling the room. He leaned forward, adjusting the dial when he heard it. Ethan. The voice was faint, distorted, but unmistakable. His brother's voice. His brother, who had died in a car accident 2 years earlier. Miller froze, his throat tight. "Who is this?" The static hissed. Then the voice came again. "Ethan, it's me. Come outside!" His hands shook as he reached for the mic. But before he could answer, Mark appeared in the doorway. Miller jumped, the radio falling silent. "What did you hear?" Mark asked, Miller's eyes filled with tears. "It was my brother. He called my name." Mark's chest tightened. He thought of the ridge fire, of the voices on the radio, of his father's voice calling him. He wanted to tell Miller it was just static, just tricks. But he couldn't, because he knew it wasn't. That night, Mark sat alone in his office, the logbook open before him. His pen scratched across the page, the words jagged. The firehouse is no longer safe. Alarms trigger with no calls. Shadows move against the light. The radios carry voices of the dead. Miller heard his brother. "I've heard my father. The fire follows us here. It wants us even in our refuge." He closed the book, his hands trembling. The next night, the alarms blared again. The crew stumbled into the bay, exhausted, their nerves frayed. But this time the red lights didn't stop. They pulsed steadily, filling the room with a sickly glow. Mark stood in the center of the bay, staring at the lights. The tether in his chest pulled hard, sinking with the pulse. He felt it dragging him forward, toward the doors, toward the night outside. For a moment he thought he saw them. Figures standing just beyond the glass, tall and thin, their forms flickering like flames. They raised their hands in unison, beckoning. Mark clenched his fists, forcing himself still. "Don't follow," he whispered under his breath. "Don't answer. Hold the line." The lights flickered, then died. The bay fell silent. The crew stood frozen, their faces pale, their breaths ragged. No one spoke. Later, in the dormitory, Miller whispered, "Cap, what if they're already inside?" Mark didn't answer. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the tether burning in his chest. He knew the truth. The burning shadows weren't just in the wildfires. They weren't just in the ruins of churches or the smoke of cabins. They were here, and the firehouse was no longer a refuge. The training burn was supposed to be routine. Every few months, the department staged controlled fires in abandoned structures to keep the crew sharp. That morning, the target was an old ranch house on the outskirts of Reading, condemned and scheduled for demolition. The perfect place to drill rookies like Miller. The sky was clear, the air dry, the valley quiet. The crew arrived in good spirits, joking as they unloaded gear. Torres teased Miller about finally getting his trial by fire. Jackson clapped him on the shoulder, telling him to keep his head down and trust the hose. Mark Hanlon watched them all, his expression unreadable. But inside, the tether in his chest hummed. He had felt it since dawn, a low vibration that grew stronger as they neared the ranch. He didn't say anything to the crew. They didn't need more fear. But he knew. The fire was waiting. The burn began smoothly. Crews set small ignition points, flames licking at the dry wood. Smoke curled into the sky, the house groaning as heat spread through its frame. Miller advanced with the hose, his movements stiff but steady, water hissing as it met the flames. "Good," Mark called. "Stay focused." "Control the line," Miller nodded, sweat streaking his face beneath the mask. For a moment, everything was normal. Then the fire changed. It surged suddenly, hotter than it should have, flames racing across the ceiling in jagged bursts. Shadows flickered against the walls, moving against the firelight. Miller froze, his eyes wide. "Cap," he whispered. "They're here!" Mark's chest tightened. He saw them too, figures shifting in the smoke, tall and thin, their edges glowing like embers. They moved deliberately, circling Miller, their forms writhing in the heat. "Stay on the line," Mark shouted, pushing forward. But Miller dropped the hose. His helmet turned toward the shadows, his body leaning forward as if pulled by invisible hands. The tether in Mark's chest yanked hard, dragging him toward the flames. He staggered, fighting it, his breath ragged. "Miller!" Jackson roared, lunging forward. But the rookie stepped deeper into the fire, his silhouette swallowed by smoke. For a heartbeat, Mark saw him clearly. Miller stood in the center of the flames, his arms outstretched, his face lit by an otherworldly glow. The shadows closed around him, their forms merging with his, their whispers rising in a chorus. Then the ceiling collapsed. The crew dragged Mark and Jackson back as the roof caved in, sparks and embers exploding into the sky. The house roared, flames consuming everything. When it was over, nothing remained but a smoldering shell. They searched the ruins for hours, sifting through ash and debris. They found Miller's helmet, melted and warped, lying near the center of the collapse. But there was no body. No trace of him at all. Torres sat on the tailboard of the engine, his face pale, his hands shaking. He was right there. I saw him, and then nothing. Jackson stared at the helmet, his jaw tight. The fire took him, Mark said nothing. He stood in the ruins, the tether in his chest burning like a brand. He knew the truth. Miller hadn't just died. He had been claimed. Back at the station, the crew was silent. No jokes, no chatter, just the weight of absence. Miller's bunk sat empty, his gear still neatly stacked. His nameplate on the locker gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Mark opened his private logbook, his hands trembling. The training burn was not routine. The fire surged unnaturally. Shadows circled Miller. He stepped into them. His helmet was found, melted. His body was gone. The fire takes who it wants. It does not give them back. He closed the book, his chest tight. That night, he dreamed of Miller. The rookie stood in the firehouse bay, his uniform blackened, his eyes hollow. He raised a hand, beckoning. His voice was a whisper, layered with others. "Cap. Come with us." Mark woke gasping, sweat cold on his skin. The tether in his chest pulsed, steady and insistent. He sat at the desk, staring at the logbook, the words blurring. He whispered the warnings to himself over and over. Don't follow. Don't answer. Hold the line. But the line was fraying, and the fire had claimed its first from his crew. The firestorm came down on the town like a living thing. By the time Mark Hanlon and his crew arrived, the evacuation was already underway. Sirens wailed, families fled in trucks piled with belongings, and the sky above glowed a sickly orange. Ash fell like snow, coating the streets, clinging to skin and hair. The town, once quiet, tucked against the ridges, was now a place of panic and smoke. "Get them out," Mark shouted, waving traffic toward the highway. "Move, move!" The crew split up, guiding residents, checking houses, pounding on doors. Torres directed cars through intersections, his voice hoarse. Jackson carried an elderly woman to safety, her oxygen tank rattling. Miller's absence was felt in every motion, a hollow space in the team. Mark pushed through the chaos, his chest tight with the tether's pull. The fire was close, too close. Flames licked at the edge of town, racing through dry grass, leaping from tree to tree. But it wasn't just the fire that made his skin crawl. It was the way people looked at it. They weren't just afraid. Some were entranced. A woman stood in her yard, clutching her child, staring into the flames. "Do you see them?" she whispered, as Mark pulled her toward the truck.
They're waiting for us. Get in the car.
Mark barked, shoving her inside. Another man refused to leave his porch, his eyes fixed on the fire. "My wife's in there," he said, pointing to the flames. "She's calling me!" Mark grabbed him by the collar, dragging him down the steps. "Your wife's gone. Move!" But the man fought, his voice breaking. "She's alive."
She's right there.
Mark shoved him into the arms of deputies, his own breath ragged. He didn't want to admit it, but he had heard it too. Voices in the crackle of the flames, familiar, coaxing. His father, Miller, even his mother, gone 20 years. The tether in his chest pulled harder, dragging him toward the fire line. He clenched his fists, forcing himself to focus. At the edge of town, the fire roared like a beast. Houses ignited in bursts, windows shattering, roofs collapsing. Shadows flickered in the glow, tall and thin, moving against the flames. They walked between the burning homes, their forms writhing, their heads turning as if watching. Mark froze, his breath caught. For a moment, he thought he saw Miller among them. The rookie's silhouette, helmet under his arm, his face pale and hollow. Miller raised a hand, beckoning. "Cap!" Jackson's voice snapped him back.
We've got a kid.
Mark turned. Jackson stood in the street, holding a little girl no older than 6. Her face was streaked with soot, her eyes wide. She clutched a stuffed rabbit, its fur singed. "She says her mom's still inside," Jackson said. Mark crouched, his voice steady.
Where's your mom, sweetheart?
The girl pointed toward a house already engulfed in flames.
She's in there. She told me to wait.
Mark's chest tightened. The house was gone, consumed. No one could have survived. But the girl's eyes were certain, her voice unwavering. "She said she'd come back," the child whispered. "She said the fire would bring her." Mark swallowed hard, forcing himself to stand. "Get her out of here," he told Jackson. As Jackson carried the girl toward the trucks, Mark turned back to the burning house. The flames writhed, shadows shifting inside. For a heartbeat, he thought he saw a woman's figure, standing in the doorway, her arms outstretched. The tether yanked hard, dragging him forward. His boots shifted, his breath caught. He heard his name whispered in the roar, then Torres grabbed his arm, pulling him back.
Cap, don't!
Mark blinked, the vision gone. The house collapsed, sparks exploding into the night. By dawn, the town was a ruin. Whole blocks reduced to ash, the air thick with smoke. The survivors huddled on the highway, their faces pale, their eyes haunted. Some whispered about the voices they had heard, the loved ones they had seen in the flames. Others sat silent, clutching photographs, staring at the horizon. The crew regrouped at the engine, their gear streaked with soot, their bodies heavy with exhaustion. Torres lit a cigarette with shaking hands. "They're not just in the woods anymore," he muttered. "They're here." "In town," Jackson nodded grimly. "And people are listening." Mark said nothing. He stared at the smoldering ruins, the tether in his chest burning like fire. He opened his logbook, his handwriting jagged. The firestorm consumed the town. Residents saw loved ones in the flames. Some refused to leave, convinced the dead were calling them. I saw Miller. The girl swore her mother was alive inside a house already gone. The fire is spreading. The shadows are no longer confined to the ridges. They are here, among us. He closed the book, his hands trembling. The town was ash, and the burning shadows were growing bolder. The Black Canyon earned its name long before the fires. Locals said the basalt cliffs swallowed light, that even at noon the shadows clung to the rock like oil. Mark Hanlon had driven past it 100 times, but he had never been called inside, not until now. Dispatch reported multiple ignition points converging in the canyon, flames racing down both ridges as if drawn to the same place. It didn't make sense. Fires didn't start in perfect symmetry. But when the crew arrived, the sight made Mark's stomach twist. The canyon burned like a furnace. Flames leapt from cliff to cliff, curling inward, converging at the narrow gorge. Smoke rose in thick columns, blotting out the sky. The roar was deafening, a living wall of sound. Torres stared, his face pale. "It's like the fire wants to be here," Mark didn't answer. He felt the tether in his chest pulling hard, dragging him toward the gorge. His boots shifted without his consent, his breath shallow. They advanced cautiously, hoses uncoiled, water hissing against the flames. But the fire didn't behave. It burned cold in places, the heat dropping suddenly, their breath fogging in the air. Then it surged hot again, searing their skin through the gear. The shifts were unnatural, deliberate. Jackson cursed under his breath. "I've fought fire 30 years. I've never seen it move like this," Mark's radio crackled. At first, just static. Then a voice, faint, distorted. "Mark." He froze. The voice was unmistakable. His father's voice. "Mark, it's me." "Come closer." His chest tightened, the tether yanking hard. He staggered forward, his boots dragging across the ash. The flames parted slightly, shadows shifting inside. For a moment he saw a figure standing in the gorge. His father. The same broad shoulders, the same lined face glowing faintly in the firelight. "Dad," Mark whispered. The figure raised a hand, beckoning. Mark took another step, the tether pulling like a chain. The roar of the fire faded, replaced by the sound of his father's voice. "It's all right, son. You don't have to fight anymore. Just come." His boots reached the edge of the gorge. The flames writhed, shadows circling, the ground trembling beneath him. He leaned forward, ready to step into the fire. Then Jackson's hand clamped on his shoulder, yanking him back.
Don't!
Mark gasped, the vision shattering. The figure dissolved into smoke, the voice fading into static. The flames surged again, roaring in fury. Torres shouted over the noise.
Cap, what the hell was that?
"You almost walked in!" Mark shook his head, his breath ragged. It wasn't real, but even as he said it, he knew it had been. The fire pressed harder, sparks raining down, shadows flickering across the canyon walls. They moved independently of the flames, tall and thin, their forms writhing. Some clung to the cliffs, others drifted across the gorge, their heads turning as if watching. Miller's absence was a wound in the crew, but in that moment, Mark swore he saw him again. A silhouette among the shadows, helmet under his arm, his face pale and hollow. Miller raised a hand, beckoning. Mark clenched his fists, forcing himself still. "Hold the line!" he shouted, his voice raw. The crew fought through the night, cutting lines, spraying water, calling in air support. But the fire refused to die. It twisted, surged, and doubled back as if alive. By dawn, the canyon was blackened, the ridges scarred, the air thick with smoke. The crew sat on the tailboard of the engine, exhausted, their faces pale. Torres lit a cigarette with shaking hands. "Cap, you almost walked into it." "You heard something, didn't you?" Mark stared at the ground, his jaw tight. "I heard my father." Jackson's eyes narrowed. "That's how it gets you." "That's how it got Miller." Mark didn't answer. He opened his logbook, his handwriting jagged, the black canyon burned unnaturally. Flames converged as if drawn to the gorge. The fire burned cold, then hot, shifting deliberately. Shadows moved against the light, clinging to the cliffs. "I heard my father's voice on the radio. I saw him in the flames. He called my name. I almost stepped in." Jackson stopped me. "The fire doesn't just burn, it lures. It knows who we are." He closed the book, his hands trembling. The canyon was silent now, the smoke drifting into the sky. But Mark knew the truth. The fire wasn't finished. It was waiting, and next time, it might not let him go. The firehouse attic was a place no one bothered with. Dust thick as snow coated the rafters. Old gear lay forgotten in boxes, and the air smelled of mildew and smoke that had seeped into the wood decades ago. Mark Hanlon climbed the narrow stairs one restless night, the tether in his chest humming like a low drumbeat. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. Maybe just space away from the crew, away from Torres's nervous pacing and Jackson's grim silence. But what he found was something else entirely. The box was shoved behind a stack of broken helmets. Its lid was warped, its cardboard soft with age. Mark pulled it free, coughing as dust swirled. Inside were old photographs, black and white shots of crews long gone, their faces stern, their uniforms heavy canvas. Beneath the photos lay a leather-bound book, its cover cracked, its spine nearly broken. The name on the first page stopped him cold. Captain William H. Keating, Cal Fire, 1952. Mark sat on the floor, the journal heavy in his hands. He flipped through the pages, the handwriting neat at first, then jagged, frantic. The entries were dated, each one a record of fires fought across Northern California. But the words weren't just reports. They were warnings. July 14, 1952. Fire at Lassen Foothills. Flames moved against the wind. Men swore they saw figures walking inside. I told them it was smoke. But I saw them too. Mark's chest tightened. He turned the page. August 3rd, 1952. Rookie went missing during training burn. Helmet found, body gone. Shadows circled him before the roof collapsed. I told the others it was an accident. But I know better. The fire takes who it wants. The words mirrored his own logbook, his own nightmares. He read faster, his hands trembling. September 20th, 1952. The voices came on the radio. My wife's voice, though she's been gone 3 years. She told me to step into the flames. I almost did. God help me, I almost did. Mark closed his eyes, the tether in his chest pulling hard. He could hear his father's voice again, calling from the Black Canyon. He forced himself to keep reading. October 11th, 1952. I found carvings in the old substation. Words etched into the beams. Don't follow. Don't answer. Hold the line. Whoever left them knew. This is older than me. Older than all of us. The handwriting grew frantic. The ink smeared. November 2nd, 1952. I am the keeper now. The tether binds me. I feel it pulling every day. My duty is to hold the line, to keep the fire from spreading. But I am breaking. When I scatter, another will take my place. The fire always chooses. The fire never stops. Mark's breath caught. The word leapt from the page. Keeper. He had written the same word in his own logbook, though he hadn't known why. Now he understood. This wasn't new. It was a cycle. Each generation had someone bound to the fire, tethered to the burning shadows, tasked with holding them back. He turned to the final entry. The handwriting was barely legible, the words scrawled in desperation. December 15th, 1952. The firestorm at Oroville. Shadows everywhere. Voices screaming. I can't hold much longer. If you read this, you are next. Don't follow. Don't answer. Hold the line. The page ended there. No signature. No closure. Just silence. Mark sat in the attic for a long time, the journal heavy in his lap. The dust swirled in the beam of his flashlight, the rafters creaking above. He felt the tether in his chest burn, steady and insistent. He wasn't imagining it. He wasn't losing his mind. This had happened before. It would happen again. He was the next keeper. When he finally descended the stairs, the crew was waiting. Torres looked up, his eyes bloodshot. "Cap, you okay?" Mark hesitated, the journal clutched tight. He wanted to tell them everything, that the fire was alive, that it had taken others before, that he was bound to it now. But the words stuck in his throat. The burden wasn't theirs. It was his. Instead, he forced a smile. Just old records. Nothing important. But that night, alone in his office, he opened his own logbook and wrote, "I found the journal of Captain Keating, 1952. He saw the same things. The shadows. The voices. The missing men. He called himself the keeper. He said the fire always chooses. He said when he scattered, another would take his place. I think I am that place. The tether binds me. I am the keeper now." He closed the book. His hands trembling. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the faint smell of smoke, and in the distance, Mark thought he heard voices. The call came with a weight Mark Hanlon had never felt before. Dispatcher's voice was tight, urgent. Massive wildfire approaching Oroville. Multiple structures threatened. Evacuation underway. All available units respond. Oroville was no stranger to fire, but this one was different. By the time Mark's crew reached the outskirts, the sky was already black with smoke, the sun reduced to a dull red disk. The air was thick, choking, filled with ash that fell like snow. Sirens wailed, helicopters thundered overhead, and the horizon glowed with a furious orange. The firestorm had arrived. Flames towered above the treetops, leaping from ridge to ridge, consuming everything in their path. Houses ignited in bursts, roofs collapsing, windows shattering. The roar was deafening, a living wall of sound that pressed against their ears. "Jesus," Torres muttered, staring at the inferno. "It's like the whole world's burning." Mark felt the tether in his chest pull hard, dragging him toward the flames. His breath caught, his hands trembling. He forced himself to focus. "We hold the line here. Protect the evac route." No matter what, the crew moved fast, hoses uncoiled, water hissing against the fire. But the flames didn't behave. They surged in unnatural bursts, curling against the wind, twisting in arcs that defied logic. Shadows flickered inside, tall and thin, their forms writhing. Jackson cursed under his breath. "They're here." Mark saw them too. Dozens of figures moving inside the fire, their edges glowing like embers, their heads turning as if watching. They walked between the burning houses, their movements deliberate, their whispers rising above the roar. The radios crackled, at first static. Then voices. Mark, his father's voice again. Then Miller's, then dozens more, layered, overlapping. The voices of the dead, calling his name. Torres ripped off his headset, his face pale. "Cap, they're in the radios!" The tether yanked hard, dragging Mark forward. He staggered, his boots sliding in the ash. For a moment, he saw them clearly. His father, Miller, the survivor from the cabin, all standing in the flames. Their arms outstretched. "Come with us," they whispered. Mark clenched his fists, forcing himself still. "Don't follow," he muttered under his breath. "Don't answer. Hold the line." But the fire pressed harder. Sparks rained down, igniting brush yards ahead. Houses collapsed in bursts, the flames surging closer. The crew fought desperately, but they were overwhelmed. A scream cut through the roar. One of the younger firefighters, separated from the line, was surrounded. Shadows closed around him, their forms writhing, their whispers rising. He vanished into the flames, his scream cut short. "Cap!" Jackson shouted. We can't hold it! Mark's chest burned, the tether pulling so hard he thought it would tear him apart. He stumbled, gasping, his vision blurring. The shadows swarmed, their forms towering, their voices deafening. For a moment, he thought he saw the truth. The fire wasn't just flames, it was a door. The shadows weren't just figures, they were keepers of something older, something vast. And the tether wasn't just a burden, it was a chain, binding him to the fire, binding him to them. He dropped to his knees, the roar filling his head. The voices screamed his name, louder, louder, until it was all he could hear. Then Jackson's hand was on his shoulder, shaking him. "Mark, stay with me!" Mark gasped, the vision shattering. The shadows flickered, their forms dissolving into smoke. The fire surged again, but the crew managed to push it back, inch by inch, until dawn broke over the ruins. By morning, Oroville was scarred. Whole neighborhoods reduced to ash, the air thick with smoke. Survivors huddled on the highway, their faces pale, their eyes haunted. The crew sat on the tailboard of the engine, exhausted, their gear streaked with soot. Torres lit a cigarette with shaking hands. "We lost 3 tonight. Just gone. No bodies, nothing." Jackson stared at the ground, his jaw tight. "The fire took them." Mark said nothing. He opened his logbook, his handwriting jagged. The firestorm at Oroville was unlike anything I've seen. Shadows swarmed, voices screamed. The radios carried the dead. The tether nearly tore me apart. We lost 3 men. No bodies, just gone. The fire is not just fire. It is a door, and I am chained to it. He closed the book, his hands trembling. The firestorm had passed. But Mark knew the truth. The burning shadows were only growing stronger, and the tether would not let him go. The hospital in Oroville was overflowing. Burn victims, smoke inhalation cases, and exhausted evacuees filled every bed, the halls lined with cots. The air smelled of antiseptic and charred fabric, a reminder that the firestorm still smoldered just beyond the town. Mark Hanlon walked the corridors with his gear bag slung over one shoulder, the tether in his chest humming like a live wire. He had come to check on survivors, part duty, part compulsion. Something in him needed to see the faces of those who had walked out of the fire, needed to know if they had seen what he had. The first patient was a young man, his arms wrapped in bandages, his eyes bloodshot. He had been pulled from a collapsed house, his lungs scorched by smoke. When Mark asked how he was feeling, the man's gaze drifted past him, fixed on the corner of the room. "They stand there at night," he whispered. "Men made of smoke. They don't blink. They don't move. They just watch." Mark's chest tightened. "What do they want?" The man's lips trembled. "They whisper. They say my name. They tell me to come back." Mark forced himself to nod, jotting the words in his notebook. He didn't tell the man he had heard the same whispers, seen the same figures. The next patient was an older woman, her face streaked with soot, her hands trembling. She had been found wandering the evacuation route, half conscious. When Mark asked what she remembered, she gripped his wrist with surprising strength. "They followed me out," she hissed. "I saw them in the flames and now they're here. In the halls. In the mirrors. You can't escape them." Her eyes darted to the window, where the glass reflected the fluorescent lights. For a moment, Mark thought he saw movement there too, shadows flickering across the surface, shifting against the glow. He blinked, and they were gone. By the third room, his hands were shaking. The patient was a firefighter from another unit, his face blistered, his voice hoarse. He had been pulled from the edge of the fire line, barely alive. When Mark entered, the man's eyes widened. "You!" he rasped. Mark frowned. "Me?" The man nodded weakly. "You're the one it wants." The words hit like a blow. Mark staggered, his breath catching. "What do you mean?" The man coughed, his body trembling. "The fire." "The shadows. They said your name, over and over." "They said you're the keeper." Mark's chest burned, the tether pulling hard. He gripped the bedrail, his knuckles white. "How do you know that?" The man's eyes rolled back, his body convulsing. Nurses rushed in, pushing Mark aside, shouting orders. He stumbled into the hall, his heart pounding, the tether thrumming like a chain. He leaned against the wall, gasping. The words echoed in his head. "You're the one it wants." Back at the station, the crew noticed his silence. Torres asked what he had seen, but Mark brushed him off. Jackson studied him with narrowed eyes, as if he already knew. That night, Mark sat alone in his office, the logbook open before him. His handwriting was jagged, uneven, but he forced the words down. "The survivors see them too." Men of smoke standing in their rooms. They whisper names. They follow into the hospital, into the mirrors. One survivor told me I am the one it wants. He said the fire called me keeper. The tether burns stronger every day. I can't deny it anymore. The fire has chosen me. He closed the book, his hands trembling. The firehouse was silent, the crew asleep. But Mark couldn't rest. He walked the halls, the tether pulling him toward the bay. The alarms were dark, the engines silent. Yet he felt them. Shadows flickering at the edges of his vision, whispers rising in the static of the radios. He stopped at the window, staring out at the night. The town was quiet, the horizon faintly glowing with the last embers of the firestorm. But in the glass, he saw them. Figures, tall and thin, their forms writhing, their heads turning toward him. They raised their hands in unison, beckoning. Mark clenched his fists, his breath ragged. "Don't follow," he whispered. "Don't answer. Hold the line." The figures flickered, then dissolved into the dark. But the tether in his chest burned hotter than ever, and he knew the survivor had been right. The fire wanted him. The old Cal Fire substation sat at the edge of the valley, long since shuttered. Its windows were boarded, its roof sagged, and weeds choked the gravel lot. Most of the crew didn't even know it existed, but Mark Hanlon had read about it in Captain Keating's journal. The entry was clear. October 11th, 1952. I found carvings in the old substation. Words etched into the beams, "Don't follow." "Don't answer. Hold the line." Mark couldn't ignore it. He drove out alone one evening, headlights cutting through the dusk. The tether in his chest hummed steadily, pulling him toward the ruin. When he stepped out of the truck, the air was unnaturally still. No wind, no birds, just silence. The door creaked as he pushed it open. Inside, the substation was a tomb. Dust coated the floor, cobwebs hung from the rafters, and the faint smell of smoke lingered, though no fire had touched the place in decades. His flashlight beams swept across rusted lockers, broken chairs, and a desk covered in yellowed papers. Then he saw them, carvings. On the support beams, gouged deep into the wood, were words. The same words Keating had written about. "Don't follow." "Don't answer." "Hold the line." Over and over in different hands, different depths, as if each generation had added their own warning. Some were neat, deliberate. Others were frantic, jagged, carved in desperation. Mark traced the grooves with his gloved hand, his chest tight. The words felt alive, heavy with meaning. He whispered them under his breath, the tether in his chest pulsing with each syllable. "Don't follow." "Don't answer." "Hold the line." The air shifted. Shadows flickered across the walls, though his flashlight beam was steady. They stretched long, writhing, moving against the light. Mark froze, his breath caught. The tether yanked hard, dragging him toward the far wall. In the corner, the darkness thickened. Figures emerged, tall and thin, their forms glowing faintly like embers. They stood in silence, their heads turning toward him. Mark clenched his fists, forcing himself still. "You can't have me," he whispered. The figures raised their hands in unison. The whispers began, low at first, then rising. His name, over and over, layered with others. His father, Miller, the survivor from the cabin. The voices of the dead, calling him. The tether burned, pulling him forward. His boots slid across the floor, his body leaning toward the shadows. He fought it, gasping, his muscles straining. "Don't follow," he whispered. "Don't answer." "Hold the line." The figures flickered, their forms dissolving into smoke. The whispers faded, replaced by silence. The tether eased, though it still pulsed, steady and insistent. Mark collapsed against the beam, his breath ragged. He stared at the carvings, the words gouged deep into the wood. He understood now. The warnings weren't just advice. They were mantras, anchors, the only thing keeping the keepers from stepping into the fire. He pulled out his knife and carved the words again, his hand shaking. "Don't follow." "Don't answer." "Hold the line." The letters cut deep, joining the chorus of warnings left by those before him. When he stepped outside, the night was darker than it should have been. The trees loomed, their branches twisting. At the edge of the lot, he saw them again, figures standing just beyond the headlights, tall and thin, their forms flickering. They didn't move. They just watched. Mark climbed into the truck, his hands trembling on the wheel. He drove back to the station, the tether burning in his chest, the figures lingering in his mirrors until the road curved away. Back in his office, He opened the logbook, his handwriting jagged. The substation is real. The carvings are real. Generations of keepers left their warnings there.
Don't follow.
Don't answer.
Hold the line.
The shadows gathered outside, pressing against the walls. They called my name. They wanted me to step forward. I almost did. The tether burns stronger every day. I am breaking, but I must hold the line. He closed the book, his hands shaking. The firehouse was silent, the crew asleep. But Mark knew the truth. The line was fraying, and the burning shadows were waiting for him to break. The call came with a tone that froze every man in the firehouse. Paradise is burning. All units respond. Mark Hanlon had heard the name before. Paradise, a quiet town nestled in the Sierra Nevada foothills. But when the engine crested the ridge, what he saw was not a town. It was an inferno. The firestorm had swallowed Paradise whole. Flames towered above the rooftops, leaping from house to house in seconds. Cars clogged the streets, their horns blaring as families fled. The sky was black at noon, the sun reduced to a dull red smear. Ash fell like snow, coating everything in grey. The crew moved fast, but the fire moved faster. They guided residents toward evacuation routes, dragging people from cars stalled in traffic, pounding on doors. But everywhere they turned, the fire was already there, racing ahead, cutting off escape. Torres shouted over the roar, his voice raw.
Cap, we can't hold this. It's too big.
Mark's chest burned, the tether pulling hard. He felt it dragging him toward the flames, toward the shadows flickering inside. He clenched his fists, forcing himself to focus. We hold as long as we can.
Get them out!
They split up, each man taking a block. Jackson carried a child from a collapsing house, his face streaked with soot. Torres pulled an elderly couple from their car, flames licking at the tires. Mark kicked indoors, shouting, dragging people into the street, but the fire pressed harder. Houses exploded in bursts, roofs collapsing, windows shattering. Shadows flickered in the glow, tall and thin, their forms writhing. They walked between the burning homes, their heads turning toward him. The radios crackled. Static, then voices. Mark. His father's voice. Then Miller's, then dozens more, layered, overlapping. The voices of the dead calling his name. Mark staggered, his breath caught. The tether yanked hard, dragging him forward. For a moment he saw them clearly. His father, Miller, the survivor from the cabin, all standing in the flames. Their arms outstretched. Come with us, they whispered. He clenched his fists, forcing himself still. Don't follow, he muttered. Don't answer. Hold the line. But the fire pressed harder. Sparks rained down, igniting brush yards ahead. Streets became rivers of flame, cars exploding, people screaming. The crew was scattered, each man fighting his own battle. Then came the moment Mark would never forget. He saw Torres, trapped in an intersection, flames closing in. Shadows circled him, their forms writhing, their whispers rising. Torres raised his axe, swinging wildly, but the shadows pressed closer. Cap! He screamed. Mark ran, the tether burning, his boots pounding the ash. But before he could reach him, the flames surged. Torres vanished, his scream cut short. When the fire receded, there was nothing. No body, no trace. Just ash. Mark fell to his knees, gasping. The tether yanked hard, dragging him toward the flames. He saw Torres among the shadows now, his face pale, his eyes hollow. Torres raised a hand, beckoning. Come with us, he whispered. Mark staggered back, his breath ragged. No, he whispered. I won't! The fire roared, furious. Houses collapsed, sparks exploding into the sky. The shadows swarmed, their forms towering, their voices deafening. By dawn, Paradise was gone. Whole neighborhoods reduced to ash, the air thick with smoke. Survivors huddled on the highway, their faces pale, their eyes haunted. The crew regrouped at the engine, what was left of them. Jackson sat on the tailboard, his face streaked with soot, his eyes hollow. We lost Torres, he said, his voice flat. Mark nodded, his chest tight. He opened his logbook, his handwriting jagged. Paradise is gone. The firestorm consumed everything. Shadows swarmed, voices screamed. Torres was taken. No body, just gone. I saw him among them, his face hollow, his hand raised. The fire takes who it wants. It does not give them back. He closed the book, his hands trembling. The town was ash, and the burning shadows had claimed another. The firehouse was silent when Mark Hanlon returned from Paradise. The crew that remained sat hollow-eyed, their gear still streaked with soot, their faces pale. Torres was gone, Miller was gone, and the weight of their absence pressed down on every corner of the station. Mark felt it most of all. The tether in his chest burned constantly now, a steady pull that never let him rest. That night he couldn't sleep. He walked the halls alone, the logbook clutched in his hand. The words of Captain Keating echoed in his head. "I am the keeper now. The tether binds me. When I scatter, another will take my place." Mark knew what it meant. The fire had chosen him. The alarms blared at midnight. Red lights pulsed across the dormitory, though no call came from dispatch. The crew stumbled into the bay, confused, but Mark already knew. The fire wasn't waiting for a call. It was calling him. He stepped outside. The night was unnaturally still, the air heavy with the smell of smoke. At the edge of the lot, shadows gathered. Tall and thin, their forms flickered like flames, their heads turning toward him. They raised their hands in unison, beckoning. Jackson's voice cracked behind him. "Cap, don't!" Mark clenched his fists, the tether pulling hard. "Stay inside," he said. "This isn't your fight!" He walked forward, the tether dragging him across the asphalt. The shadows parted, revealing the road beyond. Flames licked at the horizon, glowing brighter with each step. The voices rose, layered, overlapping. His father, Miller, Torres, the survivor from the cabin, all calling his name. "Mark, come with us." He stopped at the edge of the road, the fire burning ahead. The tether yanked hard, pulling him toward the flames. His breath caught, his body trembling. He saw them clearly now. Dozens of figures standing in the fire, their forms glowing, their arms outstretched. "You don't have to fight anymore," his father whispered. "Just scatter. Let go." Mark's chest burned, his vision blurring. For a moment he wanted to step into the fire, to let the tether snap, to scatter into the flames like the others. To be free. But then he thought of the crew, of Jackson still fighting, of the survivors in Oroville, in Paradise, in every town the fire had touched. He thought of the logbooks, the warnings carved into beams, the words passed down through generations. "Don't follow. Don't answer. Hold the line." He clenched his fists, forcing himself still. "No," he whispered. "I won't scatter. I'll hold the line." The shadows writhed, their forms twisting in fury. The voices rose, screaming his name. The tether burned like fire in his chest, pulling so hard he thought it would tear him apart. Mark dropped to his knees, gasping. "If you want me," he shouted, his voice raw, "then bind me, chain me. I'll be your keeper. But I won't step into the fire. I won't scatter." The flames surged, sparks exploding into the sky. The shadows closed around him, their forms towering, their whispers deafening. The tether snapped tight, searing through his chest. He screamed, the sound lost in the roar, then silence. The shadows dissolved, the flames receded. The night was still again, the stars sharp above. Mark lay on the asphalt, gasping, his body trembling. The tether was still there, but different now. Not a pull, but a chain. Not a burden, but a bond. He was the keeper. When he staggered back into the firehouse, Jackson was waiting. His eyes widened at the sight of Mark, his face pale. "Cap, what happened?" Mark shook his head, his voice hoarse. "It's done. I'm bound now," Jackson frowned. "Bound to what?" Mark didn't answer. He walked past him into his office and opened the logbook. His handwriting was jagged, uneven, but he forced the words down. "The fire offered me release. To scatter into the flames, to let go. I refused. I chose to endure. The tether is now a chain. I am the keeper. My duty is to hold the line no matter the cost. The fire will not stop, but neither will I." He closed the book, his hands trembling. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the faint smell of smoke, and in the distance, the burning shadows waited. Years passed after Paradise. The scars of that fire remained etched into the land and into the men who had survived it. For Mark Hanlon, the scars were deeper still. He carried them in his chest, where the tether burned like a chain, binding him to the fire. He had become the keeper, though no one else knew the word. He bore the burden in silence, his logbook filling with jagged entries, his nights haunted by whispers. But time moved on, and the firehouse did too. Crews rotated, faces changed. Jackson retired, his body worn down by decades of smoke and heat. Torres and Miller were gone, claimed by the flames. Mark remained, older now, his hair grey, his eyes hollow. He was the last of his generation. Then the rookie arrived. His name was Daniel Reyes, fresh out of training, his uniform crisp, his boots still stiff. He was eager, smiling, full of the energy Mark remembered once having. The crew welcomed him with the usual ribbing, but Mark watched in silence, the tether in his chest humming. He knew what the fire wanted. He knew the cycle was beginning again. The first night, Daniel explored the firehouse, curious about its history. He found the attic, the old boxes, the dust-covered helmets. And there, tucked behind a stack of gear, he found the logbook. Not Keating's, but Mark's. He brought it down, flipping through the pages. His brow furrowed as he read the entries. Fires that moved against the wind, shadows walking inside the flames, voices on the radios. He read about Miller, about Torres, about Paradise. He read the warnings, underlined again and again. Don't follow. Don't answer. Hold the line. When Mark found him, Daniel looked up, his eyes wide.
Cap, what is this?
Mark stared at the book, his chest tight. He wanted to tell him it was just stories, just the ramblings of an old man. But the tether burned, and he knew he couldn't lie. It's the truth, Mark said quietly.
And one day you'll see it for yourself. Daniel frowned, uncertain.
You really believe this? Mark's gaze drifted to the window, where the night pressed close. He thought of the figures he had seen, the voices he had heard, the men he had lost. Belief has nothing to do with it, he said. The fire doesn't care what you believe. The next week, Daniel went on his first patrol. It was a quiet night, the air cool, the stars sharp above the valley. He drove the engine along the ridge road, the radio crackling softly. Mark sat beside him, silent, the tether humming. At the bend in the road, Daniel stopped. His eyes widened. Cap, do you see that? Mark followed his gaze. Lights drifted between the trees, soft, golden, pulsing like heartbeats. They moved in arcs too smooth for lanterns, weaving through the timber. Daniel's breath caught. What are they? Mark's chest burned, the tether pulling hard. He clenched his fists, forcing himself still. Don't follow, he said. Don't answer. Hold the line. The lights hovered at the tree line, their glow reflecting in Daniel's wide eyes. Then a voice rose, faint, familiar. Daniel. Daniel froze, his throat tight. That's my mom, he whispered. She's been gone 5 years. The tether yanked, dragging Mark forward. He gasped, fighting it, his muscles straining. It's not her, he said, his voice raw. It's them. Don't listen. Daniel's boots shifted, his body leaning toward the lights. His breath came fast, his eyes locked on the glow. Mark grabbed his arm, pulling him back. Don't follow, he shouted. The lights pulsed brighter, the voice rising, coaxing, pleading. But Daniel stayed still, his body trembling. The lights hovered a moment longer, then drifted back into the timber. The voice faded. The forest was silent again. Daniel collapsed against the seat, gasping. That was her, he whispered. I swear it was her. Mark shook his head, his chest burning. It wasn't. It never is. Back at the station, Daniel sat in silence, the logbook open before him. He picked up the pen, hesitated, then wrote a single line beneath the last entry. I saw the lights tonight. I didn't follow. Mark watched him, his chest tight. The tether burned, steady and insistent. He knew what it meant. The fire had chosen. The cycle had begun again. He closed his eyes, whispering the words that had carried him this far. Don't follow. Don't answer. Hold the line, but he knew the truth. One day Daniel would face the same choice. One day the fire would call him too, and the burning shadows would never stop waiting. Long before the first firehouse was built, before the first settlers cut roads into the Sierra Nevada foothills, the land was awake. The forests of California had always burned, but not all flames were natural. Some carried something older, something patient, something that remembered. The pines whispered it in the wind, their needles trembling with secrets. The rivers carried it in their currents, murmuring of things that waited beneath the surface. Even the granite cliffs bore scars, blackened streaks that never faded, as if the stone itself had been branded by fire. The land did not forget. It had taken hunters and loggers, miners and wanderers. It had swallowed whole towns, leaving nothing but ash and silence. Those who vanished were not gone. They became part of the fire, their voices woven into the crackle of flames, their shadows walking between the trees. The keepers endured for a time. Each generation, one was chosen, bound by the tether, chained to the fire. Their duty was to hold the line, to keep the burning shadows from spreading unchecked. But the tether always frayed. The burden always broke them. And when they scattered, the land waited for the next. It was patient. It did not rush. It knew men would always come. They could not resist the wilderness, the promise of solitude, the lure of untouched land. They came with axes and saws, with rifles and maps, with duty heavy on their shoulders. They came thinking they were in control, but the land knew better. It waited in silence, in the hush of snow, in the stillness of fog. It waited in the gutted carcass of a deer, in the compass that spun without north, in the radio that hissed with voices not its own. It waited in the canyons where flames converged, where shadows clung to the cliffs. And when the time was right, it called. The lights drifted between the trees, soft and golden, pulsing like heartbeats. The voices rose, familiar and impossible, coaxing, pleading, mocking. The tether tightened, dragging the chosen forward. And the land watched, patient, eternal. Some resisted. They whispered the warnings left behind. Don't follow. Don't answer. Hold the line. They endured for a time, their bodies breaking, their minds unraveling. They carved the words into beams, scrawled them in logbooks, left them like breadcrumbs for whoever came next. But the land knew. It knew the warnings were futile, because the fire did not give back what it took. It waited for the next warden, the next ranger, the next firefighter. It waited for the tether to snap, for the line to fray, for the burden to pass. It waited for the cycle to continue, as it always had, as it always would. The land was awake, it was hungry, and it was waiting. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the firehouse slept, the land leaned close. The pines whispered, the rivers murmured, the cliffs trembled. The tether in Mark Hanlon's chest burned steady, binding him to the fire. He was the keeper now, but the land knew he would not last forever. One day, Daniel Reyes would take his place. The rookie would hear the voices, see the lights, feel the tether tighten. He would carve the warnings, write the logbook, whisper the mantra. Don't follow. Don't answer. Hold the line. And when he broke, another would come. The land was patient. It had all the time in the world. The forests of California would burn again. The flames would rise, the shadows would walk, the voices would call. Towns would fall, crews would scatter, and the cycle would continue, because the burning shadows were not just fire. They were the land itself, and the land waits forever.